is Austin, Texas, where I live with my wife, Ann, and I'm raising 3 children, all in public high schools here. And we're just getting back to school time in Texas. I'm a professor at Rice University, History and Humanities. And that's about 2.5 hours away in Houston. I'm honored to be able to talk to your group. Dartmouth is one of my favorite places in America, or in the planet, I should say. I come up quite a bit to Vermont and New Hampshire and spend parts of my summers up there. So it was truly, I felt special being asked to talk about restoring faith in our American democracy, a very big topic for an American historian to even begin to try to tackle. So I thought I would start with the founding of our country and tell you some stories and then get us up to our current times. We all honor founding fathers, as we often call them, the John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and the rest. But there was a man named Charles Thompson who was Secretary of the Continental Congress from 1774 to 1789. And that was the big job. I mean, Secretary of the Continental Congress meant that you were in Philadelphia, and Charles Thompson would have to call in all of the delegates from around the country. He'd give them lodging, reimbursements, and he kept the minutes of all of the meetings of the founding of our country. He was called by Samuel Adams and John Adams as the Sam Adams of Philadelphia. Thompson ran the Sons of Liberty, which would meet in taverns and private homes to plot about how to create a United States of America, how to build a democratic republic. And he had quite a bit of money because he was the #1 beer maker in New England or even the Mid-Atlantic. And he also was a lawyer, and he represented Native American rights, Indian rights in those days, on land issues throughout the Northeast in the Mid-Atlantic states. He was a brilliant person, Charles Thompson. And when they all met at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, I mean, the most important thing was to get your documents written, who said what, and get it all down. And he was the scribe of all of this. Thompson, in fact, was so important that when we did create our American democracy on July 4th, 1776 in Independence Hall, it is true Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration, but Thompson is the one who got it printed and then read it almost like a press release. Imagine Independence Hall in Philadelphia, somebody reading a press release to the Declaration of Independence to a gaggle of reporters saying these 13 separate colonies are now formed a union, and we are the principles of democracy, and we're rebelling against the King of England. On that original July 4th, 1776 document, there are only 2 names on it, John Hancock and Charles Thompson. And it is Thompson and Hancock who were wanted for treason instantaneously. And they were told to be captured by British authorities and hung at the gallows. So Thompson and Hancock had to go in hiding, but eventually they reconvened the Continental Congress that August of 1776. And that's the moment when you have the famous signing ceremony, and Hancock puts his name so large, that the king won't be able to miss it. That's because Hancock and Thompson said, look, if we're going to die, if we're going to get a call for treason, you all are in it together. And so put your signature, put your John Hancock on that piece of parchment. That's the document we think of as our Declaration of Independence. And I ask myself as an historian, what happens to a document? What happened to that? Well, a signed copy went to Britain, but also there's one that remained in the United States. And that, if you go to the National Archives, that is what you see as under glass, probably our single most precious foundational text the founding of our country, the documents of July and August of 1776. Thompson not only went in hiding, but in many ways he was the first archivist of the United States, because he would save all of the papers and the minutes. And when I say minutes of the founding of America, most of the representatives in Philadelphia, very few, I should say, were really willing to break away from Great Britain. It was a gradual process. In fact, there's still debates. They became great friends in old age, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, even though they had been political adversaries, but they debated till their dying days, where did the American Revolution begin? John Adams insisted it began with the Boston Massacre, and you had Jefferson saying it began with Patrick Henry's capture and oratory and Nathaniel Hale in Virginia. So even over what sparked the American Revolution and where did it begin, there's disagreement, regional disagreement between Massachusetts, a free colony in regards to slavery, versus Virginia, a slave colony. And these differences of what the American narrative are have come on to both unite our country, but also creates deep divisions still in our democracy. We sometimes have our own regional histories that don't match up with the national one. But Thompson, beyond, had to flee and hide in the American Revolution. But eventually, as you know, George Washington prevailed at the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. We won. The 13 separate colonies now had to have unity. Washington was the only pure figure that could have brought unity to our country. Do keep in mind when we talk about George Washington, his genius was that he was a topographer, a surveyor, that he knew every knoll and creek, every rolling hill, every apple orchard, every trout stream, every pond with frogs, all throughout Virginia, including modern day West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. He was a genius of reading the land, of geography. And so, in many ways, Washington was a guerrilla fighter. He knew how to live off the land, where the British Army and their German Hessian troops that came here to stop the American Revolution, they were clumsy. They would be marching in order. They had overwhelming amount of equipment. Reminds you of us in the Afghanistan, and where we had all of this military superiority, but we still have to withdraw because people that live on the ground know how to do things in a guerrilla theater fashion. So Washington was like a guerrilla fighter. When you hear about the Battle of Princeton or Trenton, really it's Washington sneaking up at the middle of night and around Christmas time and just firing musket balls and drunk, sleeping German Hessian mercenary soldiers, and then disappearing into the woods down pathways where they couldn't be found, crossing rivers and streams in an intricate way that the British or Hessian troops couldn't follow. But when we won the Battle of Yorktown, the idea was, you're at George Washington. You're the one figure that can unite this country. And it was Charles Thompson who went to Washington's estate at Mount Vernon in Virginia along the Potomac River and told Washington, you got to be America's first president. Washington was deeply reluctant. He wanted to continue to operate as a agribusinessman, if you'd like, landowner, land speculator, and crop grower. And instead, he had to agree. And so there's this great moment in American history when George Washington is on a horse with Charles Thompson at his side, doing this journey from Virginia to New York City, to Wall Street, to Federal Hall, to get sworn in as America's first president. I urge all of you, as a homework assignment, if you ever are in New York City again, take the time, if you haven't already, to visit Federal Hall. There is the site where George Washington was inaugurated as our first president. It's run by the National Park Service. You could see the Bible that Washington took the oath of office. This federal hall, incidentally, became the seat of the first government of the United States. It's where the Articles of Confederation is conceived. It's the home of the Bill of Rights. It's considered the birthplace of free press because of the John Peter Zenger trial that was held there. It's a sacred spot that's often overlooked because everybody focuses on Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Go to the Federal Hall. The building there now is a beautiful Greek Revival building because the building came down in 1812, but the Greek Revival building's been there ever since. And it sort of dominates the skyscraper landscape of Wall Street. Standing by Washington at that moment was Charles Thompson. He was like a zealot. There he is. And people don't realize that it's Charles Thompson who chose the eagle to be the symbol of the United States when Ben Franklin wanted the turkey. It was Charles Thompson who actually drew, like a stencil kit, the seal of the United States that today, if you turn on TV and see Joe Biden, you'll see it at a podium or on Air Force One or the like. That's his design, Charles Thompson. He wanted women to have equal rights. He wanted Native American rights, and he wanted the abolition of slavery. Guess what? He didn't get any of those. In fact, he was considered too radical to be part of the Washington administration. And as was Tom Paine, who wrote Common Sense. And he ended up having to live in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, with no role in the Washington administration. Because the one thing they did not need in that first administration was rabble-rousing or lobbying or what today you'd call civil rights activity or anti-slavery zealotry. The task of our democracy was to cobble 13 independent colonies together to act as one and to create foundational texts that would make that work. One can easily argue that the finest government ever conceived in the history of humankind occurred in New York and Philadelphia in the 1780s and 1790s with conceiving of how a country could hold together. The fact that here we are, we're going to be approaching in a few years our nation's, I think in 2026, there are going to be a big celebrations for America being 250 years old. So our experiment in democracy has worked. And Thompson deserves a great deal of the credit for it. But, he went back and started saying, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the history of the American Revolution, use all the minutes I took in Independence Hall, and he had written 1,000-page book. But in it, he told the real story of Adams and Jefferson and all of their real arguments and how many were really with Britain to the very last minute. And then we had our first big political fight in 1800 when it pitted Thomas Jefferson, Democrat-Republican Party, versus John Adams of the Federalist Party. And let's just freeze for a minute on 1800 and keep in mind that Washington did 2 terms, and he did well. I run the work with Brian Lamb and Susan Swain and Richard Norton Smith at C-SPAN Network, and we rank the presidents every 4 years. And we just came back with the fresh ranking in July, and Washington is ranked number 2. He's always, can you guys still hear me? Can anybody put a finger up? If I see. Am I up? Good. Sorry about that. We've had a little technical problem. I just started hearing beeping. I just want to make sure I'm being heard. And so we ended up. Washington did a good job as 2 terms. He's ranked number 2 behind Lincoln and presidents of all time. But the great thing that Washington did for democracy was stepping down. Washington said, I don't want a third term. Everybody said, you've got to stay or the country's going to collapse. He said, if I stay, then we are just a third-rate monarchy. By me stepping down, it proves a democratic process. And it forced that election of 1800, and it was brutal. I mean, I know we've endured in our lifetime events like Trump versus Hillary Clinton, ugly debates and name calling. Well, it was equally nasty and ferocious in 1800. But what made that election so seminal is it was the birth of the modern political party system. And keep in mind forever, there's nothing in our founding documents about two parties. This emerges out of 1800, and it doesn't look very promising. The pounding that Jefferson and Adams's supporters played on each other, they called them atheist and demented and uncouth and unsavory, every ugly name imaginable in the newspapers of the day. And it became so ugly, or at least I should say, most people wondered whether the United States could hold firm. But alas, we made it through that election, and we get John Adams as our second president, and we have Thomas Jefferson as our third. But Thompson decided to burn all of the founding 1,000-page book he wrote. He threw it into a fireplace and burned all of it. Burned the minutes of our Continental Congress. Why? Well, he wrote Jefferson and John Jay, key figure in the Federalist Papers and in constitutional history. He wrote Jefferson and Jay different notes, but with the same general explanation. Our country will never survive if we don't make heroes out of presidents. That the country can pull behind the president, unite, and then get things done. Otherwise, we're going to stay in permanent party warfare mode. And election will end, and people will say it's not a fair election. And then they're going to go argue, and then it'll be, they won't do business with the other party. And instead, we're going to have anarchy instead of democracy. So he burned all that because he wanted to sanitize the founders. And it worked for a while, maybe really up until the last 20 years. And there became a cult of George Washington, purposefully born to show that once you're president, you unite the country. We named our nation's capital after George Washington. We have our great Washington Monument, the most recognizable monument of the United States and one of the most famous in the world. We named a state after Washington. Washington's on your quarter. He's on the dollar in your wallet right now. More counties are named after Washington than anybody. Books started pouring out in the 1820s on George Washington left and right, most famous by Parson Weems. And Weems would try to say, told the story of Washington telling his father, I will not lie to you, I chopped the cherry tree down, or making up the tall yarn that Washington took a coin and threw it across the Rappahannock River in Virginia. All bunk, all tall tales, all to build Washington up as this larger than life patriarch. And a statue is erected in Federal Hall in New York City of him by John Adams, his son, John Quincy Adams, that we must honor Washington. And the same with Adams and the same with Jefferson. I mentioned to you that 1800, how ugly it was. I consider the private correspondence between John Adams and between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, I consider those founding documents their letters, because they were so smart at the end of their days. They realized we need to, in the public arena, make people think we're friends. It'll be good for the country to see that these two people who seemingly loathe each other have put their differences aside, and in their twilight years have become dear, respected friends. I know everybody has limited reading lists, but Gordon Brown, professor of history Gordon Wood, professor of history at Brown University, wrote a marvelous book a few years ago. I reviewed it for the Boston Globe on that friendship that developed late in life between Adams and Jefferson. I recommend it. And even more so, I recommend just sometime reading that correspondence. They were seeing it to heal our nation. And that tradition continues on. I mean, right now, George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, for example, are great friends. Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford became closest of friends. Bush 41 became great friends with Bill Clinton. You can go on and on like that and see these people that once were at each other later in life say, we're tight. It's the reason why presidents go to other presidents' funerals to say we put our political animosities aside. And so we start this steady drumbeat. Incidentally, the Northwest Ordinance, I consider a foundational document, was also created interestingly enough, at Federal Hall in New York. And that gave America, Ohio and Indiana, Illinois. And it starts the beginning of American expansion. We're leaving our original 13 colonies and we're growing. But there are a couple of major challenges that come before the Civil War, which are worth me mentioning. One, and when I mention the Northwest Ordinance, which needs to be known more about because it really is so important. But Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson's buried at Monticello and in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he did not want on his gravestone president. He has founder of the University of Virginia, author of the Declaration of Independence, and other accomplishments, but he didn't think president was something you bragged about. That's how deeply things have changed. But Jefferson's presidency is extremely important because Jefferson was the only leading politician of the top tier that saw the Mississippi River as the spine of America. Everybody else thought of the Mississippi was the most we'd ever expand to, that we might go from Atlantic to Mississippi, but anything west of the Mississippi belonged to the Spanish, the French, the British, Russia, but we were going to curate from the Mississippi River eastward to the Atlantic, and that was going to be the United States. Jefferson said no. It's the spine of America. He had continental ambitions. Jefferson is the ardent expansionist. And Jefferson's the one in the name of science that dispatched Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to leave St. Louis and go up the Missouri River through North Dakota and Montana, all the way to Astoria, Oregon, meaning over the Continental Divide and Rockies, to find a shortcut for trade to China. It's an extraordinary story, the Corps of Discoveries. You all know about Sacagawea, and you probably know about Lewis as a naturalist collecting flora and fauna in these incredible diaries and journals they brought back. What you may not realize is when they got back, they were afraid to see Jefferson because they felt it was a failure, that they had to tell Jefferson there is no shortcut to the Pacific, that your dream of coast to coast, Atlantic to Pacific, may be a pipe dream because those Rocky Mountains are impossible to get over in any way that would make sense. And there's no way we could build civilizations out there anytime soon. So depressed was Meriwether Lewis that he started taking a lot of opium and committed suicide on the Natchez Trace, feeling that he as an explorer was a failure. Of course, we know he wasn't, and his journals, of Lewis and Clark journals, are also kind of foundational documents of America because it's telling us for the first time about our native flora and fauna and our potential Western holdings. He also, Jefferson, released Zebulon Pike, After George Washington, Pike became the second biggest hero in America, a name largely forgotten today. But Pike Roads, going down a pike and all this is coming after him. He was set by Jefferson to leave St. Louis and went all the way up the Mississippi to find the headwaters of the great river. He misdiagnosed it. He chose Lake Cass in Minnesota when it was Lake Itasca, but it was pretty close. And meanwhile, he was planting American flags all over in modern day Iowa and Minnesota, Wisconsin, claiming that region for the United States. So if you do the Northwest Ordinance and then that with Lewis and Clark with the Western Vector, after Pike went up to Minnesota, he then went and found the headwaters of the Red River, the Arkansas River, and he went all the way out to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where Spanish authorities captured him and took his diaries and notebooks and put them under arrest. And Jefferson threatened war, seriously almost went to war with Spain over demanding the release of Zebulon Pike and his team, and the return of the diaries and journals. 10 years before Lewis and Clark's story was presented in the congressional record, Zebulon Pike's went in. Pike got something else wrong besides the headwaters of the Mississippi. He wrote in his diaries that Nebraska of today is a desert where nothing could ever grow. Well, of course, it's now the breadbasket of the world. But he ended up, Pike, getting serving in the War of 1812 as a brigadier general, was killed in the Battle of York in Canada. York was the name of Toronto of today, and he's buried there. There's right now, as I speak to you, people want to exhume Pike and move him to Pikes Peak, Colorado. That's when he first saw the front range of the Rockies, the first Euro-American to do so, and that famous Colorado landmark is named after him. I could give you more, but you get the point. Jefferson's dispatching people to build this United States democracy from coast to coast. And at the same time, he sends as ambassador plenipotentiaries, negotiators, his friend, the young last of the great Virginia dynasty, young James Monroe, and the richest real estate dealer in New York City, Robert Livingston. And Jefferson sends them to France to negotiate with Napoleon Bonaparte to acquire one thing, the city of New Orleans. Because if you own New Orleans, you own control of the commerce on the entire Mississippi River. And so they went there, and at this point, Napoleon had just faced a terrible setback in Haiti with the Haitian Revolution and an embarrassment of being defeated there. And Napoleon came to the conclusion that they weren't going to be able to hold on to their territories in the New World. There's a reason you don't have French language spoken in South America and Latin America. French got out of the game. France got out of the game. But he sold to Jefferson's ambassadors, Monroe and Livingston, the whole kit and caboodle of not just New Orleans, but the Louisiana Territory, which doubled the size of America. Monroe knew the mind of Jefferson, meaning the expansionist mind. He said yes to the deal, $60 million. Boom, our country's doubled in the size. It's called the greatest real estate deal in world history. They come back and Jefferson's elated, except Jefferson's got a problem. People in the Senate, Congress don't want the Louisiana Territory. For one thing, it is French-speaking people, ne'er-do-well drifters, largely indigenous people, and it seems like a trick for the expansion of slavery in the South. And so New England, people around Vermont and New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, they were opposed to the Louisiana Purchase as a trick for slavery. So what's Jefferson to do? He decides to sell it as national security, and he succeeds, meaning we're buying this as a buffer to protect us. If we build a civilization from, the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi, we need this territory all around us so we're not attacked, that it's not British, French, or Spanish territory, it's American. He got that through. And overnight in New Orleans, the American flag replaces the French flag. A part of my talk today, I'm dealing with talking about these foundational texts. Here comes one out of Jefferson on religious liberty. He writes a long letter to an Ursuline nun in New Orleans. She writes him in French and says, "Dear Mr. President, I don't speak English. I'm a French citizen. I'm now under a new American government. I'm afraid I'm going to be persecuted." Kind of letter or outcry you're getting from Afghanistan from people right now. A new government, no new, what's going to happen to me? And Jefferson writes her back a long, brilliant letter saying, "Madam, you are the quintessential American. You take care of orphanages. You look after people sick. You are healing the beloved community, and we will defend you and embrace you, and that you actually are on the top rung of great Americans because of all you're giving back to people." Beautiful letter saying Catholicism is great by me, that we are not a Protestant country, and continue with your Catholicism, continue with your good works. This is Jefferson at his best. When you look at Jefferson and Religious Freedoms, you read Jefferson in his book on Notes on Virginia, where he deals with race. It's Jefferson at his worst. In modern times, the reputations of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are being bounced about because they were slave owners. Washington seems to be faring better because upon his death, he freed his slaves, where Jefferson did not. And of course, with Sally Hemings and other stories, Jefferson's sort of been in writings on race are troubling, where Washington doesn't have troubling writings on race. So, when you look in modern context, certain ones of our presidents and leaders are faring better in 2021 than others. But needless to say, even as a slave owner, Washington still remains our second greatest president, and Jefferson is a top 10 president also. Slavery is the curse. Not just slavery, but the fact that it's a limited democracy, that it's really white men, landowners. Andrew Jackson's able to crack that open some by having simply white men voting more, not quite having the wealth requirements. So our democracy is starting to reform itself. And in there is the genius of the democratic experiment. We're constantly reinventing our democracy without losing a sense of our core foundational text. We can talk about, I don't want to belabor, what happens to, it might be just worth saying that War of 1812 is the big deal. That is the war where Washington burns. And you famously know Dolly Madison having to take heirlooms out of Washington as it's on fire. And it's not hyperbole when we stand up or put our hand on our chest for the national anthem of Francis Scott Key's composition. Because of the Battle of Baltimore at Fort McHenry fell, there likely would be no United States today. Our democratic experiment would have gone bust. It was that close. So when we have debates over whether to stand for the national anthem or not, that's everybody's individual right to treat that as they wish, but do always remember that it came out of the crux of our survival as a democracy. That song is representative of that. And the lyrics become almost a foundational text of its own right. But the Madison, one of my favorite presidents, I urge people to get a chance to read about democracy, the diaries between James and Dolly Madison. They were, as a husband and wife, they were regularly writing each other their thoughts about how to perfect this union. But as you know, we've had other troubled times leading before the Civil War. We got very divided in America, just like we are today, over what to do in the Mexican-American War. As you know, I believe in 1836 is the famous Alamo moment, but the Alamo is about Texas independence from Mexico. White Euros, mainly Germans, some Czechs, Scots-Irish, but the Davy Crockett, Colonel Travis story at the Alamo and all is for Texas independence. But once Texas is its own Lone Star Republic, it eventually Mexico wants to claim it, continue to have it. And you have the Mexican-American War. And President James K. Polk gets elected and says, I'm going to do two things as president. I'm going to beat Mexico, and we're going to have Texas is going to stay in the United States, as is what is today Arizona, New Mexico, California. And he says, I'm only going to serve one term. He was a teetotaler, Polk, wrote diaries. Polk's diaries are foundational text. Very few presidents have kept detailed diaries. None has kept them as well as James K. Polk. But Polk went in and sent General Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande and basically said, start a border skirmish with Mexico. Let's have it out. And much of the country thought this was a war of expansion and an illegal and immoral war. The Mexican-American War of the 1840s, if you go to Mexico City, you'll see a museum of American intervention. Many Mexicans feel this was stolen from them. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. In New England context, famously, Henry David Thoreau, my personal hero, because I write a lot about environment and conservation, but Thoreau wrote his famous essay on civil disobedience when he went to jail and wrote about going because he won't pay taxes to the Mexican-American War. If that war drug on, it could have ripped our country apart. But it was we wanted and wanted quick. And the two things I said Polk wanted to do was get that clear border in the South, but then he negotiated with Britain what is modern day Seattle, Washington State, Puget Sound border, British Columbia and Washington. That could have been a war. But by the time of his one term, now the United States had what is today the 48 states. And as you know, Hawaii and Alaska come later to make 50. But after the Mexican-American War, everything is about slavery, slavery, slavery. And how can we be a democracy if we're holding people enslaved? And this is the burning question. I urge people to read David Blight, Yale University professor's recent biography of Frederick Douglass. And it deals with William Lloyd Garrison and the abolitionist cause in the 1830s and 1840s, 1850s. And eventually the cataclysmic moment, the defining moment in American democracy, the Civil War occurs in 1860 and 61. Remember Abraham Lincoln, who is the top president forever, when he runs for president in 1860, as opposed to slavery, he realized that Lincoln's not even on the ballot in 7 southern states. I mean, we're talking about recounts from 2020 in Georgia. Imagine just you weren't even allowed on the ballot in 7 states. So now he's president, leaving Illinois. He has to have a body double to get into Washington, D.C. The executive mansion, which is today's White House, the name the White House doesn't come to fruition until Theodore Roosevelt dubs it that in the early 20th century. So Lincoln sitting in that executive mansion, lacks security, goats and cattle grazing on the lawn. And Virginia breaks away from the Union with all the other southern states. And Maryland is a hotbed of secession, although it stays neutral during the war. But do you realize, if any of you travel and let's say you go to Dulles Airport in the Metro Washington in Northern Virginia, that's mileage-wise, that is right outside of just a short drive from the White House. That was where the Battle of Bull Run was fought. And the Confederates won the Battle of Bull Run. I mean, that's how close we were to not having a United States anymore, that to being separating into two separate countries. Lincoln is the great president because he perseveres. It didn't look like in his first year he would. He appointed General McClellan, who ended up failed to take the fight to the Confederates. It's only through Ulysses S. Grant capturing the Mississippi River in the all-important Battle of Vicksburg and starting the march through the South that we have taking the fight to the Confederates in their home territory, that eventually we will win the war. But during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln offers not one, not two, but 4 foundational texts that define American democracy. His first inaugural of the demand that we're fighting for union and to keep the democracy together. This famous second inaugural, and the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Gettysburg Address. And I just will tell you something briefly about that second inaugural. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery, was there. Here's the sea of Lincoln's given the second inaugural. It's a sea of white Americans listening to Lincoln. And there's Frederick Douglass towards the front, able to hear Lincoln's speech, a lone black face. And afterwards, people paraded to meet Lincoln at the Executive Mansion / White House. And there was a long queue line. There were ushers, and you had to have your name on a list to meet the president. And Douglass got in line, acting like his name was on the list. But when he got to the usher guards, they said, "Sorry, sir, you're not here." And he said, "Well, I know Lincoln will want to see me." They said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Douglass, you're not on the guest list." And he pulled out like a business card and told the one usher, "Please just hand this card to the president. I promise you he's going to tell me to come in." And this usher did do that. And Lincoln said yes, he wanted to see Douglass. And at that moment, he walked in, and Douglass very politely said, "I don't want to take any of your time. You have so many people waiting. I just wanted to let you know I was here." And Lincoln said, "Well, tell me how I did. What did you think of my oratory?" And Douglass said, "It was a sacred effort. It was a sacred effort." When I'm talking about these foundational texts, these are our sacred documents that keep us glued together. It's like a cohesion, cement, trying to keep our country together. And with the Emancipation Proclamation, it's a whole new America. I mean, very easily, everybody likes to go back like I did to the founders, but you could begin, as Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the great historian, used to say, modern America begins with the Civil War. And in recent year, when Donald Trump was twice impeached, we've been hearing about Andrew Johnson's impeachment. And we're hearing about the difficulties of Reconstruction, the difficulties of integrating and people of different races, the ostracizing of recent immigrants. I mean, Irish came to America after the 1840s potato famines, were considered dirt, un-American, beasts. Catholics were raged against. Millard Fillmore, who was an American president, when he left the White House, became a leader in the Know Nothing Party. this major third party in America, the Know Nothings. They represented anti-Mormons, anti-Catholic, anti-Jews, on and on. It was like a white nativist party. And so when we look today at these currents of nativism, of xenophobia, they've been with us since the founding. It just rears its head in ugly fashions from time to time due to various circumstances. From Lincoln all the way to Woodrow Wilson, a lot of presidents. You have Republicans in the White House. The only exception is Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, who was president 2 times, but not consecutively. So if Donald Trump ran for president in 2024 and won, you'll be here, or even decides to run in 2024, you'll be hearing about Grover Cleveland, the only president that didn't have connected terms, but nevertheless had 8 years. But most of these Republican presidents ran on their war records. They're all fascinating, but I'm not going to belabor what James Garfield did in the Civil War, Rutherford B. Hayes or Chester Arthur, but they were war heroes for the Union cause. And might be the way to make that point, that a big leadership role in our democracy has often emerged out of the military. That's why we picked George Washington to lead the country. He was a great military leader, or Andrew Jackson, or Ulysses S. Grant after the Civil War. But also all of these were generals, and these slew of Republican presidents leading up to Theodore Roosevelt, had these distinguished Civil War records. William Henry Harrison was the great, general war hero. The reason is then the leadership can show itself. In order to be a great general, you'll get reviews from the men, and so we used to pick our leaders that were military fighters or icons of some kind, because they had already proven their leadership capability. We don't have that anymore. Barack Obama didn't have military service. Bill Clinton didn't have military service. George W. Bush didn't have military service. Donald Trump, it's a different world. But that used to be one of the key cements, that you would have your military record and you would run on it. And that only ended really with Bill Clinton's election in 1992. And even then, when Clinton ran for president, he ran it, in 96 against Bob Dole, war hero. Barack Obama ran against John McCain, war hero. It still has credence, but not like it used to. So the revolution, guys, in our American democracy that really gets at modern democracy is Theodore Roosevelt. And TR is president from 1901 to 1909. And not only did he name it the White House, but Theodore Roosevelt begins this tradition of intense executive power. One can argue that the 19th century, Lincoln aside, people in Congress had power. Daniel Webster, or John C. Calhoun, or Henry Clay, the list is long, were just as powerful as presidents in the political realm. That's no longer so after the advent of Theodore Roosevelt. TR was born in New York City in 1858. He grew up in a household that was arguing. It'd be like being in a Trump versus Biden household today with parents on different sides, only much, much worse. That Theodore Roosevelt's house had, in Theodore Roosevelt's home, his mother was for the Confederates and his father was for the Union Army. TR felt there'd be redemption in the West. And at that point, in the middle of the Civil War, when North is fighting South, Lincoln built the transcontinental railroads connecting east to west. And that tells you at bad times, we've got to go forward. If we're having COVID right now, we've got to use the COVID crisis in our democracy to say, well, we're going to take this research and it's going to help medical science later. And then we're going to learn how to be more prepared for the next time. And that we're going to, we go to the moon, but now we're going to learn from the moonshot how to put satellites in that will help GPS or help create the modern revolution of today. But Roosevelt just would sign executive orders. I'll give you one idea. He saw the Grand Canyon. Senate didn't want the Grand Canyon as a national park. They wanted to mine it for zinc, asbestos, and copper. TR said, do not touch it. God has made it. We'll only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone. And he signed an obscure piece of legislation that was meant for saving Native American artifacts. He signed it, and we have a million acres put aside where you can't touch because Theodore Roosevelt's flexing executive power. And that executive power, TR says, comes from Lincoln able to emancipate the slaves. And after Theodore Roosevelt's remarkable presidency, we are truly global. William McKinley and TR together gave us the Great White Fleet Navy. They believed that America had to be a great power, one of 3 or 4 countries. They built the Panama Canal. And we start becoming the leader in engineering in the world. And we still are. There's nobody like America in the engineering realm. And we become, after World War I, the financial capital of the world. It shifts from London to the United States. Of course, Woodrow Wilson, who was able to win only in 1912, because it still would have been Republican presidents. He wins only in 12 because Theodore Roosevelt created the Bull Moose Party, the most successful third party in American history. Comes in 2, but gave the presidency to Wilson. And of course, Wilson starts our Federal Reserve, the idea that the federal government's going to grow, and the idea that presidents have executive power galore. What does this mean? I mean, after World War I, we had the Republican presidencies of Herbert Hoover and Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding. They didn't go well, although Coolidge is greatly admired president and should be for his fiscal conservatism, but for also his very prescient and welcome views on race and equality. But it's the Great Depression hits with the stock market collapse in 1929. And Franklin Roosevelt is sworn in as president in 1932. And from 1932 to 1980, our democracy was restored by the belief that the federal government is your friend. FDR's New Deal program, they call it the alphabet soup, but he'd do a civilian conservation corps and plant 2 billion trees. He built a WPA to build bridges and freeways. We all know what the New Deal was. Social Security, the government's going to help you with the pension when you're old. That we're going to reform Wall Street so nobody cheats you. In World War II, we have the Manhattan Project and industrial mobilization, factories working to win the war. It's all the federal government is coming to the rescue. Uncle Sam, the Yanks are coming. Everybody's starting to believe in the power of the federal government. And of course, you could say, well, that is the legacy of FDR. Big government, large government, making people believe, if you're a farmer, the government will teach you soil conservation. If you're, if you have an insect problem, we'll come up with chemicals to get rid of them for you. But then after the New Deal and FDR comes Harry Truman, and he's still in the shadow of Franklin Roosevelt. And Truman tells people after World War II, the government is your friend. He has a fair deal domestic programs. He integrates the armed forces. But Truman creates the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Department of Air Force, the National Security Council, Joint Chiefs of Staff. I could go on. Government's going to protect you from the bomb. It's going to protect you from communism and the Soviet Union. Now you might say, well, he was a Democrat, Truman. So yes, it's a long shadow of FDR. 4 terms elected FDR, then Truman. What about Eisenhower, president from 53 to 61, Republican? Eisenhower creates the interstate highway system, the biggest public works system in world history. You don't need to go to China and stand next to the Great Wall and get a photo of a remarkable backdrop. Just get on stand on I-75 and photograph yourself. The world had never seen a system like the Eisenhower interstate system. Eisenhower created NASA to go to space exploration and peace. Eisenhower created the St. Lawrence Seaway, connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. In Little Rock, the federal government comes in with troops to integrate the schools, to follow the government, Brown v. Topeka, to integrate and start doing away with racism. John F. Kennedy's right, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. What big government? We spend 4.4% of our annual budget to go to the moon. Kennedy creates the Navy SEALs. He creates the Green Beret. Lyndon Johnson follows him. Lyndon's all in the shadow of FDR. He's trying to make his great society bigger than the New Deal, saying government is your friend. Creates Medicaid and Medicare and National Public Radio and PBS, and creates departments of transportation and urban renewal and wild and scenic rivers and all sorts of new historical preservation, and governments coming to your rescue. Even through Vietnam, government has had a chance. And then Nixon creates the EPA. Nixon creates clean air and water. Nixon is affirmative action government. Jimmy Carter creates FEMA. Jimmy Carter creates, the Department of Energy. And then Reagan. And since 1980 till today, we've been living in the age of Reagan, which is turning in the age of Trump, which is suspicion of the federal government, that the government's dysfunctional, the government's not your friend. And this has manifested itself. The Vietnam War contributed to it. Lyndon Johnson's lies, McNamara's lies, Kissinger's lies, Nixon's lies, but many reasons for it. But our big problem of destroying faith in our democracy is got to come from restoring faith in the federal government. If we don't believe the government's our friend, that the government's not out to help us, that the government's not evil, then it's hard to keep our democracy together. So the government's got to do a better job of reassuring people of its competence, and educators have to go back to teaching civics, geography, American history in a way that we start engaging young people in our democratic experiment, admit its flaws of our democracy, but look at all of its greatness. There's no country like the United States of America. We are still the country anybody in the world would feel envious living in, but we're now ripping at each other, and hurting us has been conspiracy theories of history, the lack of public service by young people, decline in civics education, and the fact that people don't honor enough the sacrifices of past generations to bring us to a moment where somebody like Barack Hussein Obama could become president of the United States, and on the recent polls ranked number 10. And that we now have Kamala Harris, a woman, as vice president, and soon to have a woman as president. So our democracy is still vibrant. Don't give up hope about it. But we've got to find ways to restore faith in government in order to make our democracy whole and function. My last comment is that the good news of 2020, the bad news is January 6, 2021. The good news was more Americans voted than ever before. With those high voting numbers is the future of America, because people are waking up that they need to for democracy to work, it has to be highly participatory, and that we need to not treat all people in government as throwaway figures, but build them up when they deserve to be built up. We're too often trashing our leaders and in a sea of mockery, and instead honoring pop stars, sports stars, and not real statespeople when we find them. Thank you.
Our country with all the things that we've been able to accomplish despite all the adversarial circumstances we have. And I want to tell you how glad we are to have you, how fortunate we are to have you. And I recommend the audience also to read as many of your books as possible. He's written over 20 books, each one of which is soundly, carefully researched and very, very readable. I've read two of them. One is on FDR and one is on Teddy Roosevelt, both of them talking about their environmental endeavors. And it was something that is very, very relevant today. The next one I'm going to read is American Moonshot, about the program to develop the United States space program under President Kennedy. And all of the positive examples that you've given us, I think, are important. And you talked about maintaining the luster of our leaders. And some of these are myths, perhaps, but sometimes when we attack leaders too much, we lose our sense of pride and our sense of identity, our sense of unity. Basically, last Thursday, all of us heard Bill McKibben, an environmentalist who lives in Vermont, talk about climate change. And he said, and I quote, "If you cut emissions by about half by 2030, on the bleeding edge, it's on the bleeding edge of what is technically possible." So yet you are all familiar with government inertia. So the question is, my first question is, despite public awareness of something so dramatic and necessary as survival of the planet, and you're an environmentalist also, as well as a government and history expert, then what can we do to make our democracy work to solve these dramatic problems? After all, there was the Civil War, there was the Depression, World War II, World War I, all sorts of calamities. This is the biggest one yet, it seems to me. So what can we do when there are so many vested financial interests entrenched?
Well, thank you. And again, thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be able to be with you all today. I think the big thing on dealing with climate change is going to be to convince the media, culture as it is, to make it the primary story. Back when Walter Cronkite was the lead on CBS News, CBS made space the big deal, and culminating with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin going on the moon in the summer of '69. But then CBS said, let's make 1970 the year of the environment. And the CBS started covering every night environmental degradation, and they showing dead fish in Lake Erie or poisoned, rivers and befouled cities filled with smog, and they just drove it home. And this, led to the first Earth Day in 1970, which was covered all over by television networks as a major event. And it's not because of that media coverage, it forced the hand of Richard Nixon to create the Environmental Protection Agency just months after the first Earth Day. And it officially came into operation that same year with William Ruckelshaus, the first head of the EPA, meaning the public clamor and the coverage by the media could change things. Right now, I'm afraid we've become so driven by reality television and social media that climate change is never a front burning story. I mean, it should be every day climate issue here on whether it's Fox or MSNBC, whether it's NPR or right-wing talk radio. It should be being the lead story, and it never is. In recent presidential debates, it didn't even get raised. And so the media, I think, is their best way. We are living in an era of mass communication. I'm looking at the 1960s, and I do feel like with people like Bill McKibben, there are many Bill McKibbens, none quite as who writes like he does and thinks and organizes as well. But we have, hundreds of groups already, nonprofits that can lead the way, but they just need to get exposure. My network, CNN, we were running a segment called Planet in Peril for a while, and it didn't get the ratings. And suddenly people, let's cover, something more dramatic. And I think that's unfortunate. I think we've got to find a way to work with the media culture of today and make climate change the number one issue. At hand is the survival of the planet. And when I would meet regularly with these dinners, history dinners, we'd call them, with Barack Obama in the White House. And one time President Obama, we were talking about all these issues, including Afghanistan and Iraq and the voting rights and on. And he said, but boy, when climate kicks in, it's game over. We're going to be having all these other things are going to be secondary. I'm afraid climate has kicked in. I'm terrified for what's going to continue this summer in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California with wildfires, and eventually the droughts that are going to be taking place around the world, and the massive human displacement, food shortages, making the idea of getting a viral or bacterial diseases more prevalent due to the losing of displacement of wildlife. It is one giant crisis we're in.
You said that the media's role is important, but we also have to have a responsible media, and technology
Right.
has intervened in the sense that has changed some sources of political influence, such as with Facebook, with its algorithms, which enhances and amplifies and forwarding the misleading and exaggerated content, or even Russian bots, which attempted to influence a national election. What is the remedy using our democratic tools to be able to counter that misinformation and disinformation, which is against such important solutions that we have to find?
That may be the biggest question of our time, because the misinformation is killing the United States right now. That people feel entitled to their own set of facts, that the social media world is filled with charlatans, that basic factual history is not possible anymore. Really, we're dealing with a country where a third of Americans don't believe we walked on the moon, that they believe 9/11 was a hoax. This is a crisis we're in of education, and I think we're going to have to create very tight standards. Everybody is a freedom of speech person. It's the thing that we all love about the United States, but I do feel that we're going to have to clamp down on how people are misusing Facebook and other platforms. We've seen the banning of Donald Trump from it. We're seeing people putting in timeout boxes from it. I think that's going to have to increase, and we're going to have a new set of regulatory standards, because to spread the amount of disinformation we're doing is costing lives. Look at how what should have been a moment of perhaps American triumph over COVID-19 due to the vaccines being produced has turned into now just utter confusion. We're throwing vaccines away. People are ripping at masks. Schools are having disagreements, and it's become an awful mess because science isn't trusted. When John F. Kennedy was president in 1960, scientists were Time Magazine's People of the Year. Scientists as a whole had an 85% approval rating. Today, people don't trust science community because they feel like this scientist says this, and this one will say that, this doctor will say this. So we have no kind of public common square of information that we can all rely on. And we're going to, at the very least, have to get the bad actors out of the paradigm of social media, and have, and perhaps break up some of these large companies like Facebook.
Also, there are several questions from several of our viewers that have to do with public education. And of course, you are an educator in many ways, as a speaker and as a professor, and of course, as an author. But so many Americans are unaware of so many of these important elements that you brought out, and indeed some of the very more basic facts. Even as there was a poll about the number of Americans who could identify the different bodies of government, the separation of powers. They couldn't name them. And Thomas Jefferson said, whenever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. So that in many states, there are many states that require civics education in high schools. And some states require civics education as well as a test, and New Hampshire is one of them in the latter category. Some states don't require any civics education at all right? But Illinois had an interesting idea to follow up on your previous commentary about the media. It's the first state in the country to introduce a course in high school, or require it, media literacy. Media literacy would be using the modern tools of technology, but knowing not to just trust what you see on the screen, but to check other sources to see what the background is, or the proof of what is asserted on screen is likely to be. What is your comment on education, on democracy, and on our history in schools?
I love the commentary you just made on media literacy. I find it to be one of the solutions to this disinformation crisis. The late Walter Cronkite, I got to know quite well. I was a historian at CBS, and I ended up writing a biography called Cronkite. And he had one thing, and it was bothering him the most about the future of America. And it was that the iPhone or the internet, he considered it like a wild west of information, disinformation, and yet we were turning it over to our kids at 8, 10, 12. The most 10, 12-year-olds now are getting an iPhone, and they can go surfing in different sites, yet we never did a media literacy class. How to use this as a tool. It's here to stay. We're not going backwards, but how do you use this tool properly to not get on either hate sites or misinformation sites, but also to be able to double source or something, or triple source? We don't do that. We just say, here, go at it, kids. So you're going onto pornography sites or drug dealing sites, or just bizarre, false, theory sites. I saw recently that it's a hot thing with young people to say that Stevie Wonder really isn't blind, and it spreads on these sites, and young people start believing these things they're reading. And so I think it should be mandatory, probably around third grade, to start and have a regular class through elementary, middle school, high school, where you're doing media literacy education. And that way you have an informed citizenry, which knows, at least if they're reading a site, that this is hokum, or that this is a place you don't want to go. This is the dark web. This is a neo-Nazi recruiting station. I mean, and if we don't do that, we're just giving them all of these abilities to get bad information. I mean, including being recruited into militias and terror sites. It's just remarkable that we've allowed that technology into our hands of our children without any instructional manual.
And there's just naming a person who sent in a question. I'll read it because it's rather lengthy. This is from William Hoffman. He said, you build an interesting case that respect for America's great achievements and foundational principles, together with an appreciation of the uniting effort, the recognition of the good that government can do, are essential to restoring our democracy. But you've not explained how this can be done persuasively with American constituencies who feel aggrieved by what you portray as the positive march of American history. You hinted that American history has gradually more fully honored its founding principles by extending the vote to women, freeing the slaves, etc. But can you address this issue more head-on and suggest how the country might currently address issues of social justice in light of current partisan divides that in many ways center around social injustice?
Well, that's a great question. Social justice, we have to keep beating the drum. It's part of an American tradition. I mean, I mentioned, Thoreau, but I mean, we can talk about so many people from Rosa Parks to, Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez. It's all about Bobby Kennedy, all about fighting for social justice. And the story of America is to, due to all of our shortcomings, we keep expanding our ability to understand what real democracy is. I mean, as much as we can bemoan what's going on in our country today, we have made a lot of achievements. Look at LGBTQ marriages, same-sex marriage hitting the books. Look at our attempts now to decriminalize marijuana in the sense that we're not putting people in prison for life, over it. Look at the ability for something like Black Lives Matters to touch a lot of people. I was in Boston last week, and there on Fenway Park is on the big banner, Black Lives Matters, right on the ballpark. I've seen it particularly well done in New England. I think I'm in Texas, and I don't see churches with Black Lives Matters banners on it or a public outreach like that. So we are 50 states, and some states are doing well with moving forward with social justice, like let's say Massachusetts, and some states like Texas, where I'm at, are resisting it because of fear of losing the monopoly in Texas of kind of white male power, infrastructure in coming years. But look, you enter my city, Austin's airport. It's named after Barbara Jordan, an African-American congresswoman. And, Houston had the first lesbian mayor in the United States in Texas. You look at a figure like Beto O'Rourke, who's working on the border and talking about, and marching with LBJ's daughter, Lyndon Johnson's daughter, Lucy Johnson, on voting rights. We just have to keep pressing forward, and realize when you're doing so, it's part of the American tradition, that you're not an outlaw, you're not, doing something that's a deviant behavior. Promoting and marching for voting rights is as American as anything can possibly be. But this divide, I do worry we're having an urban versus rural divide. So in my state where I'm at right now, Texas, there's this sort of, a very healthy social justice mindset, let's call it, that you can feel in the cities, in Houston and Austin and San Antonio, but you go 30 miles out and you're feeling an old style kind of prejudice, xenophobia, disdain of women, getting equal pay and equal rights. And that's problematic. So there have been some mistakes made by a lot of people. I talked to Steve Case, one of the great internet entrepreneurs, and he had something very interesting, that we left some places behind with technology, like in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Western Pennsylvania. At the same time, due to NAFTA, all these companies left the Midwest. They call the Rust Belt. They went to Mexico and the Philippines companies instead, gutted out towns like Toledo and Akron and many others, and never got them ready for Wi-Fi. Never had them plugged into the new technology. Instead, there should have been, when we were having the miracle of Austin and Silicon Valley and the Microsoft crowd in Seattle and MIT and Dartmouth and Washington corridor, it would have been smart if the Midwest, if these tech companies started growing earlier. They are now, and Columbus is starting to boom on technology, Ann Arbor, Madison, Indianapolis. So we're getting there. But that left a lot of people in an older economy and afraid of the new tech economy, and that made them afraid of change, and change made them afraid of political change, where so many women now are senators or in Congress or talking openly about women's right. The Me Too movement, which has been by and large a really positive thing. There are times it goes overboard, but it's been by and large very positive, but it frightens an older generation. And I think the left in America, progressive, have to be a little more conscious of generational schism. Somebody 80 years old or 90 is going to talk a certain way of their generation, and they're not going to be up that you can't say that today. So I think all of us have to have some empathy. If you're hearing somebody say something and you don't feel it's of a malicious intent, it's just an old, gone school way of saying something, I don't think we need to ostracize or beat them out of American, life. We have to have a little bit of understanding that change is hard for people. And so we have to remain open-hearted, even while towards our oppressors or to people that are angering us because of their thick skullness. But we can't do it by just screaming at people. We have to do it by keeping the high ground.
There's a person named Anne Applebaum who writes about dealing with divisive situations, and she was writing about Ireland and the peace negotiations. And specifically, she said, well, the way you talk to someone who's very adversarial is to try to solve a small problem. For example, a community center or something like that. Don't go right at the big problems right away, but that way you can demonstrate that you can work together.
Absolutely. 100% agree with that. You start with the little things. That's why on a local level, America's doing better. I mean, I think people they're not walking around saying who's for Trump or who's for Biden or we're trying to humanize those situations. I read a lot on philosophy over the years, and the great Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who won 2 Nobels, he always said, it's not, you don't really have, you just have to frame yourself right. Like don't try to punish people because they're wrong or they're different than you. You try to treat them with empathy and a bit of humanity, and then try to see, can you find common ground and collaborate on something? It might be getting a stop sign up on a little village, and might be collaborating on cleaning of rivers and lakes. When I speak on the environment and I go in rural America, if I use the word environmental, I lose the audience. They've just have learned to think that the word environmental is either an elitist word or a liberal Democrats talk. But if I talk about, I love, Cato Lake, and wouldn't it be great to have fishing and have the lake healthy again? Everybody says we want the lake healthy again. Everybody wants the river healthy again. Nobody wants dirty air. So we have to find ways to communicate with each other. And I do believe sometimes it starts smaller. I start teaching at Rice University, my history classes next week. And when I have students on the climate, even in environment, and what can I do? When I feel they're overwhelmed about it, sometimes I say, well, adopt a place. Adopt a state park or national park. Be a friend of a particular park and keep an eye on it. We need watchdogs for every state park, national park. Adopt a species or two that you work with to try to have them survive the age of climate. Break it down some. Otherwise, you just get this large thing of climate change. I can't do anything. What can I possibly do? It's so large. And I think maybe doing it, at least to get started, taking on a concrete, smaller project will bring you new friends, joy, and it'll get you maybe out to a particular local park, and you become, like the Lorax and Dr. Seuss speaking for the trees. You can speak for a particular river or forest or state park or seashore because you've learned what's going on there and the environmental degradation that's going on, but also the wonders, natural wonders that are occurring at that place.
That brings me to a question from Cynthia Stile, who says, if we were to require all Americans to give a year of public service in the interest of preserving and strengthening our democracy, what large project would you have us work on?
I would, without a question, do a climate conservation corps. We're trying to do it some states on a piecemeal level. I think if it became a large national endeavor, and by that I mean finding ways to do mitigation in the age of climate, going for a year in uniform, that a serious commitment for a year or two of public service where you're trying to build new wildlife corridors, you're trying to help with forest fire management, you're working with farmers to meet the problems of drought, that you're learning ways to replenish burned out wetlands. One could go on, but it would be a year of sort of planetary service, a Peace Corps based in America to start with, on just getting a year service to try to help us have a greening, a beautification of America, and to be watchdogs in this time of dramatic change in the natural world.
And Roland Kutchell asks a question. He says, yes, we do need to restore faith in the federal government, but do you think we need to reform our election system? This is more structural. And he says, gerrymandering.
That's one of the big, look, let's be honest. One of the big debates since I've been a child and before that, but is the Electoral College versus the popular vote. I mean, if we had had the popular vote, Al Gore would have been president in 2000, not George W. Bush. And Al Gore may have put climate change first and foremost. And maybe Al Gore wouldn't have gone into Iraq and Afghanistan in the way George W. Bush did. And, you could do what if history forever. But the truth of the matter is, I mean, Hillary Clinton had more votes than Donald Trump. Al Gore had more than George W. Bush. That the Electoral College is helping Republicans today. And it's helping, I can tell you right now, I can tell you what states are going to be red and blue, and so can everybody else in 2024. And then there's going to be these same swing states. Who gets Michigan? Who gets Ohio? And very easily we can have a president who gets a Republican get elected without the popular vote. It can happen again. And that when that happens, it makes people think, is this a democracy? Isn't it supposed to be one person, one vote, you count them up? And unfortunately, I don't think the Electoral College is going away soon. So I think it's not going to happen in the current political world that we're dealing with. So people have to play national politics with the electoral map, meaning Hillary Clinton needed to spend a lot of time in Wisconsin when she ran for president. She didn't go once. Meaning right now, instead of meeting at Martha's Vineyard in the summer, maybe go visit the Wisconsin Dells or the lakes outside of Cleveland, or the northern peninsula of Michigan by Traverse City, beautiful areas. But those states are going to matter a lot in national politics. They're going to matter on voting rights and the future of our country and who's in the Supreme Court. So we have to pay attention to these swing states. It's unfortunate because a healthy democracy, it should be two parties in each state, and you're looking for the best policies and candidates. But with this amount of division going on now, blue, red, the battleground is in 4 or 5 states, and you've got to prepare in advance for those. I grew up in Ohio, and I knew a good buddy of mine voted twice for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. And I asked him, how do you go twice Obama, then go Trump? And he told me, well, Hillary Clinton never came to our county and never ate at the local restaurant where they all of them eat at this restaurant. And so it's like, you're kidding me. You're willing to go, change like that. So there's a feeling of that flyover country, that Rust Belt thing, a disdain of elites, which me being at Rice University and here at Dartmouth, there's a feeling that we feel we're better than the people in North Dakota or South Dakota or Michigan or Oklahoma. And we have to engage in those states in a way that makes them feel that we don't feel superior. We just want to help bring places along to the technological age that we're living in, and also learn from some of their values and virtues that you go. I was in North Dakota this summer, and I learned a lot of positive things from the people there. So yeah, maybe people in New York and California need to spend time in the Great Lakes region and get to know it. It's spectacular up there.
There's a yellow light that's flashing that January 6th could happen all over again. And I'm referring to a group of political scientists across the country, over 300 of them based in Dartmouth and in Rochester and Chicago, who did a study. It's called Bright Line Watch. And they said that 55% chance that some local officials will refuse to certify the vote count. Local officials refuse to certify the vote count in 2024, one. And two, that 46% of one or more state legislatures will pick electors contrary to the vote. Both of the observations are threatening, yes.
It's a frightening future, and that could happen here. The reaction in Georgia and Arizona and other states, in Texas, but many others, that in Florida, that the key now is if you have voting rights has become a democratic issue. It's John Lewis. It's about expanding rights for minorities and by and large. And the Republicans don't want that because, when you have 95 or something % of African Americans voting Democratic, they don't want to expand it. And they're using their state legislature, their state laws to try to find ways to keep voting, particularly in impoverished pockets of America or minority neighborhoods, down. And I find that very troubling. I find it super troubling because they may be able to do that within the parameters of the state law. And so then that has to go to the Supreme Court, or we have to create federal legislation, which has been proving to be somewhat difficult. So it's just it is frightening. I just remind everybody that the whole point of history, the whole point of having me here is to remind us that our own times are not uniquely oppressive. We are always born in a crisis. I don't know, is it worse to be in America now? I don't know. I'm sitting in an air-conditioned room here. I'm able to talk to you on a Zoom-like device. My good friend right now just gave yesterday his kidney to his mother who needed a kidney transplant at Mayo. There are a lot of modern medical miracles. We have longer life expectancy and longevity, but we really have challenges, but every generation does. I do worry that the climate crisis is such an existential threat and that we are destroying the natural world at such a rapid clip. We've been doing that since the end of World War II, that we're going to get our comeuppance here soon. I mean, you just can't be mauling and poisoning the planet at the level that we're doing. And it's just like a runaway train. And I don't have easy answers for that, but we clearly have to get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But it's a difficult political endeavor. Barack Obama tried mightily and failed, and Trump went back to the oil, gas, coal world, and now Biden has got a full plate of other problems, and it's hard for us to grab the climate issue by the scruff of the neck and prioritize it. But I'm afraid if we don't, it's just going to be a drumbeat of bad things to come, and we will have to find ways to adjust.
There's no deficit of let's say conflict and rancor in our nation's history. All you have to do is look at a book or a display of political cartoons from the past. There's been a preoccupation with corruption, usually in some of these cartoons, money influencing government, like the Tammany Hall cartoons, satire. It's not just satire, but it was by Thomas Nast particularly, are very sharply done. And also, even there was a controversy when Benjamin Franklin was given a diamond-studded snuff box when he was ambassador to France. It was thought that was a big calamity. It was against his moral virtue and so on, when really at that time it wasn't any threat to his behavior at all. But anyway, so some things are dangerous to behavior and some are not, and are forming corruption. But however, we do have one item, which is the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court in 2010, which strikes down certain restrictions on political spending by corporations. In other words, it was so narrowly defined that it has to be a straight up exchange of money for official acts. To use the Benjamin Franklin example, it would have had to be the snuff box resulted in favorable policies for France. So the Supreme Court is really devolved into the role of our interpreter of, or our adjuster of the Constitution, because it's too hard with our divisiveness to put forward amendments to the Constitution. So instead, we rely on a narrow coterie of judges who are there for life to interpret our Constitution. So what do you suggest to be able to remedy the tremendous influence that as a result of Citizens United decision and other factors?
Oh man, that's a whole lecture in itself. Citizens United was a disaster, and it's the beginning of this big money into politics in a way. I don't think we can run for president without being a billionaire or having $1 billion in your financial arsenal. That's a sad development. It's also been made very hard for a third party to really emerge, unless you are a billionaire like a Ross Perot or Michael Bloomberg or something. So it's just another troubling aspect of things. The Supreme Court's tricky. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt tried to add 6 justices to the Supreme Court to go from 9 to 15. And that was famous court packing in 1937, and it didn't happen. But recently, some people are thinking that, maybe the Supreme Court needs to have more justices. I don't think that that's going to work either, or it's a good idea. It just tells you how important elections are. I mean, Donald Trump was able to get in 3 Supreme Court justices. And that's going to be a major part of his, influence, even though he's a one-term president and ranked as one of the worst. So you've got to fight for these political races. So it's all about getting out there and caring, campaigning, whatever state you're in. Don't think your vote is a waste. And say, I tell people to pretend that you're not just one vote, you're 10 votes. If you can go and convince 10 people to vote the way you want, you're suddenly walking around as a 10 voter. So meaning get people going, explain ideas, and hopefully reforms will come. I mean, if you study the history of the United States, things are reformed always. I mean, and so Citizens United might be scrapped. It might be reversed someday, but you have to have the political power to do that. And it's we've been cursed in the 21st century, I think, it's just so tight, these elections, that we're unable to get a real mandate to move things forward in any in any bipartisan way. I'm afraid that bipartisan things is temporarily a thing of the past. I know politicians and the Republicans did not want to be in a photo op with President Obama. If you ever, a lot of them didn't want to be seen in the frame of with Obama. Democrats don't want to be seen with Trump. Republicans now don't want to be seen with Biden. That never used to be. It always used to be just to be by the president showed you were a power player and you're getting things done. But now you're serving not the United States of America, you're serving your political party. And in that, and then even more micro, you're serving the base within that political party. So our sense of common endeavor we're finding it's eluding us right now. The reason that I wrote my book, American Moonshot, was looking at how did we do it? Not only did we go to the moon, it worked. Apollo 11 was essentially flawless. We put all these billions together and people didn't complain. It was a public endeavor. What's the new moonshot? And my answer is we need an Earth shot. It is really time now to take climate change seriously and to start repairing the damages of Earth. We can't allow California to lose all of its great forest and the rainforest to disappear and to have every summer Italy and Greece burning and mega typhoons and hurricanes. And we've got to take seriously the cost of all this hyper industrialization that we're doing and find cleaner, more efficient ways to manufacture things and produce energy and have a different, hopefully electric or another hydrogen fuel cells, a different kind of a way to drive and end the poisoning of the air that we've been doing at such a grotesque rate. So I just think this is, if you're young and you're looking for the future, it's somewhere in that realm of environmental reform, how we start finding ways to manufacture things. Someday, Listerine, the mouthwash, was named after Dr. Lister, who was driven out of the medical business because he said alcohol will kill germs. Dr. Lister said pus in a wound is not a good thing. He was considered a quack. Now it's just basic medical science. Someday, people are going to look at our thinking of having coal factories this late in the 21st century as something so barbaric and antiquated. Why'd we still be on coal, even though we know why we shouldn't be? It's going to be hard to explain how primitive our thinking is because our technology is there for a new clean energy revolution, but our politics aren't there. And without the politics and leadership and media in place with it, it's just pocket programs of walking into a sustainable building here and one there, but it doesn't have a uniformed effect on the nation or the world writ large.
I think that your call is clearly heard in this, and it should be heard across the United States. And it's a theme that goes, I think, throughout so many of your books too. And it's through education and through discussion among ourselves that we can survive and unite around this country, which is great. It's a great country, and we should appreciate it more, as you pointed out. And it's encouraging that in a Pew poll for the past 2 years, that 84% of the people believe it's possible to improve the level of confidence have in their government. With people like you helping, I think it's possible to. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's really special, and I appreciate all of you. Wonderful job you do in public education, and I hope I was able to be a little entertaining and a little informative, but also leave you with a message of hope. We'll get through whatever we're dealing with now. We will prevail. We have to keep an optimistic, winning attitude.
Thank you, and please come and see us. Okay?
I'd love that. I'm looking forward. I'm sorry I'm not there, but to be continued. I'll be up there soon.
Okay.